government bench will take the lesson from today's debate on how to set better cases. We agree with that. What we would argue on side closing opposition is we will reconcile the differences between the teams in the debate. There were two contexts. First, in the context of oppressive regimes, whether suicide is something legitimate, and secondly, in the context of a liberal society, whether or not it would be legitimate in those cases. So before moving on to our two extensions which will reconcile the differences in this debate, let us look at what closing opposition had to say. First, they say that, well, we need suicides because it would destabilize autocratic regimes. This is exactly what he said. He said that he characterized those regimes as regimes which have systematic control over governmental institutions. And he also said that when people make informed decisions to commit suicide in collective groups, it would be somehow better to send a publicity to the rest of the world to gain some sympathy towards them. Big problem solution mismatch. Why? Firstly, we completely agree with the characterization of a systemic control of all governmental institutions. That is why we tell you, in all autocratic societies, there is an iron grip on the media which is supposed to be displaying the very information that they want towards the public within the nation and towards the international community as a whole. We think that this very systemic control is proportional to the level of autocracy. The more autocratic a government is, the less media freedom you have to express dissenting political views against the state. And the less autocratic it is, the less of a reason you have to oppose the state. So they're kind of in a catch-22 here. None of this characterization of complete control of the state over the media is favorable to them. But even if they didn't lose this debate at this point, secondly we would argue, let's take a logical look into this debate. They stated that no, one man's committing suicide is not that good. Kim Heng said that we're going to do this in collective groups. Last I checked, you need as many fighters as possible to fight those oppressive regimes. I don't think that committing suicide in collective groups helps the very burden that they have decided to undertake to show us why it is better to topple autocratic regimes. And thirdly, third response towards that is the criteria that opening government set up, that is to say that it needs to send a clear message and that it has to cause no third-party harm, are violated with this idea because they want to instigate people to cause third-party harm to other supporters of this autocratic state. And secondly, we tell you that this idea that it sends a clear message isn't there because the state has control over the media and can recharacterize the suicide as something that is favorable to them. So opening government fails in their own case, using their own goddamn criteria. Therefore, we argue, our position as closing opposition in this debate is that it is better for people to fight to the deaths, like in the Arab Spring and like in Syria, and suicide should never be considered a legitimate form of expression towards governments in those states. It makes things worse. That was our first extension. Secondly, we would argue, and this is where we reconcile differences in this debate, we argue that it makes situations definitely worse in the autocratic societies. Now let us take a look at more liberal societies where suicide can be considered as a legitimate form of expression. This is what they would say. We would disagree with that still. Why? Because our position is simple. We argue that since Albert himself conceded that there might be other avenues of expression and that this debate is not about the necessity, we agree to that. But we are going to tell you that using rational arguments in the public sphere to convey your own opinions is much better than using suicide to do the same thing. Why? Which brings me exactly into our... Take a seat, Albert. Which brings me into my extension. We would argue that the usage of suicide as a method of expression to convey your position in a particular issue leverages the emotional capabilities of citizens who are supposed to make an informed decision on this issue before they give you the support, and this is in itself harmful. Because we would all agree that in the public sphere, people have a right to provide some information. They can convey their views using various methods. using politicians, the media, the public, which have an incentive to listen to your cause if your cause is just. And if your cause isn't just, then there is no incentive for them to listen to you. That is why we argue that if a cause is so just as to warrant suicide, other methods are far better than suicide. But exactly why are the methods far better? We will talk to you about the harms of suicide. We would argue that when a person commits suicide, either by self-immolation, it invokes deeply rooted feelings, deeply rooted emotions. No, that's bad for you, Albert. Why? Because we argue that people are generally predisposed to react emotionally towards death. And that exactly is the problem. Because our premise here is that when citizens need to make a choice to support a particular cause, this cause has to be just. And the only way that citizens can rationalize on that is to have a proper information to do so in the first place. The moment you use an emotionally disturbing thing like suicide, it leverages the hardwired instincts of people to be predisposed towards an emotion over the rational decision-making capabilities of those people. And we argue that in cases where those issues are indeed conflicting, the one side that has to lose in this issue is the side that does not use suicide as a counter-leverage towards this issue. That is our problem with suicide. We argue that in liberal democracies, when you can allow for other forms of expressions, when politicians are more than willing, the media is more than willing to listen to controversial and just causes, where it is most likely going to be represented and aired in public, we argue that when we cross the step and use suicide, you make this cause a cause which is unjust because of the means that you use. You prevent people from making decisions on the real values behind why you're going for suicide, and you make people use emotions more about it. And under liberal democracies, the premise is that citizens need to make a decision based on information and not on rationality. That is why we proudly oppose and we win this debate. Thank you.
Thank the member of the commission now.